Before the Blair Witch Project, we had Snuff, a 1976 grindhouse horror that convinced audiences its final scene was real. The brutal and sexualised on-screen murder of a young female production assistant was marketed as the bloodiest thing to happen in front of a camera, and we bought it. Snuff wasn't real, it was fiction, but it inspired real outrage and prompted playwright Sarah Daniels to create Masterpieces, a play we're reviving for Ireland in 2020. Why? Because we want to talk about porn, about violence, about the ways we paint women and the ways we censor them. And to start that conversation, we've gone face to face with the experts. These are their voices.
Hi, my name is Dr. Sarah Cleary. I am a doctor of horror.
I'm Dr. Dara Downey, and my background is in American Gothic.
Final girls, bird breasts, torture porn. These are some of the terms we've come to associate with our scream queens, the women of horror. And while there's no shortage of female mutilation on the silver screen, horror has also given us imposing heroines, women who face down the masked man and win. Dr. Dara Downey and Dr. Sarah Cleary have built their careers on understanding the Gothic and exploring women's place in that world. That's why we went face to face with Ireland's leading horror buffs to talk jump scares and titillation.
The interesting thing about Snuff for me was not necessarily the actual film itself, it's the release and the distribution of Snuff is what created the original furore around it.
They set out to create a moral panic.
But there was this emerging kind of bubble of kind of urban legend coming out of Argentina that snuff films were in existence. So the distributor then said, you know what, we have to change the ending and let's throw in this, murder so that we can actually ride this urban legend and get some bang, In this case with Snuff, this moral panic was manufactured primarily as a means of marketing.
With an awareness that there's going to be, like you say, kind of screaming headlines saying ban this sick filth. And does that mean then that the film was equally cynical in setting up what was going to be a feminist backlash? Oh, people are going to hate this.
I suppose it's no more cynical than any sort of marketing drive, really. It gets us to consume. But what's interesting about the original release of this was that they actually hired people to protest, holding their Father Ted sign saying down with this sort of thing. They were hired actors.
And what that does, I think, is kind of, it sets up while undermining the idea of bra-burning feminists as people who are on a hair trigger and who are prepared to be outraged at any possible thing. It actually suggests that that's itself an urban legend.
The early 70s and mid 70s was this really weird time where you had extreme left-wing anti-pornography feminists walking down the road hand in hand with staunch evangelicals. And it was mental.
When Snuff was released, the idea of a real snuff film was still urban myth. In 2020, there are dozens of well-known active shock sites hosting photos and footage of torture, murder, and dismemberment. In 2012, now notorious Luca Magnotta posted a video showing the murder of Yun Lin on the still active site bestgore.com. In a world where snuff is no longer a fiction, does horror have a moral responsibility?
Does horror have a social responsibility? And my answer to that is no. No art has a responsibility to anybody. There's a beautiful phrase if you go all the way back to 1954, to horror comics, during federal investigations into the alleged effects horror comics had on children, federal investigations, Bill Gaines, who was the owner and operator of EC Comics, who had these beautiful range of horror comics, he was actually put on the stand and sweating, and he was by himself and everyone was against him, and he came up with this great phrase and he said, the law should only concern itself with the sane.
If we're gonna think about the question of whether or not horror has a social responsibility, I think maybe we need to stop and say that actually society has a social responsibility, and that It's so easy. Like, I think that kind of films and books and TVs are just the easiest scapegoats in the world. No text is able to control its own meanings to that extent. And I don't think that that's an overly fancy thing to say. I mean, I think the whole kind of history of people writing things has proved that no text can control its own meanings. And when you were talking, I was really thinking about They Live, and the way that, like, for a long time, the left have seen They Live as like, oh, this is the most amazing film. We're all being controlled by these, you know, kind of powerful financial overlords who are completely brainwashing us, and they're actually like evil, horrible looking aliens behind it. But the far right have co-opted.
We as a society have responsibility to look after the insane. Art doesn't. Art is a maverick. Art is allowed to be insane, okay? And our response to it is what should be measured.
So easy to say, this is the cause of all of these problems, when actually no one is kind of stopping and saying, maybe if we kind of like fixed some social inequality, that might actually make people a little bit less angry.
Does horror have a cultural voice? 100%. All art, all good art does. We do not like to be dictated to. We like to have our cultural commentary with a spoon of sugar, and horror has always given us that spoon of sugar.
A 1989 study observed a 90% increase in homicide rates in the US following the introduction of television, a statistic used to support the idea that 10,000 annual homicides are the result of media exposure. This conclusion ignores a vast range of complicating factors, but it is more generally accepted that edge-sitters, those already likely to commit violent crime, could be triggered by exposure to violent media. All of which begs the question, what is horror saying about violence against women?
What I would say, and this I would be quite staunch in this opinion, is that the horror genre is the only genre that has put women first and foremost and given them a voice, even if that voice is screaming.
Like you say, it places women center stage. It says, when a girl says, I don't think that house is very nice, you should probably listen to her.
Listen to her, yeah.
You know, there's that guy hiding in the bushes. She's not making it up. She's not hysterical. There's probably a problem here. If you watch a trailer, sometimes horror trailers are awful.
Yeah.
They're just pure money shots.
Yeah.
You get like the worst bit, you get women screaming, you don't know why they're screaming, your imagination starts running wild. And if that's all you have, if you get these little kind of flashes of the worst
Women
bit.
in peril.
Women in peril. You're like, this is dreadful. How could anyone do this? This is just implying that all women are victims the whole time. You actually have to watch the damn things. See the plot, see how it plays out, see how the women have the central roles. They are the ones with the knowledge who should be listened to.
Probably one of the most striking aspects of this for me is Mare Zachariah's I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. And everyone knows the iconic poster for that is the girl walking, you know, this beautiful bottom with her, you know, her knickers and in complete disarray and blood all down her thighs. And that's the famous image. And you get this absolute visceral anger from a lot of feminists who completely, you know, who just deplore this film. Because they say, well, look at that, they're absolutely objectifying this woman. The absolute beautiful thing about I Spit on Your Grave, yeah, I know, beautiful and I spit, it doesn't really blend, but was the only weapon she had against her attackers was her sexuality. The very thing that quote unquote got her into trouble, she weaponizes. And she uses it to her advantage. She gets into the bath with them and she starts fondling with them. And everyone's like, oh my God, she's asking for it. Why? Blah, 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 blah. And they get crazy. And it's like, no, she cuts his dick off.
Yeah.
And she, you know, she weaponizes her sexuality because she had nothing else.
Yeah.
And that's what horror has always done with its sexy women. It tells us sometimes that the only thing, when you have nothing left, you still have one of the most powerful things in the world, yourself, your sexuality. Go out there, flaunt it.
I mean, certainly for me, kind of what a lot of, say, like slasher films are about, ultimately is about kind of one particular woman ultimately stopping male violence.
No coincidence that typically the trope of the final girl is the Virginia girl, it's the, the goody two-shoes, the one who isn't sleeping around. But by the end of it, physically, you can see a change in her. She's sexualized. Yeah. She, the outfit is torn. She's covered in blood. The white dress is completely soiled. And what all this is telling us is that you don't be afraid of your sexuality. Use it as a weapon if you need to.
Exactly. Yeah.
Against the patriarchy. And that for me is what horror does. Horror has always done guys a terrible injustice.
Oh yeah.
They have died in the most horrific of ways. It's this idea of, men have been explicit victims within mainstream horror films for a very long time.
Maybe it's not that there isn't enough titillation from men being killed, but that people just don't care.
Just because you are used to the conventions and the tropes of a horror film does not necessarily desensitize you to what you're watching on the screen. What we are desensitized by is history books we have in primary school, where it will just toss off a number.
Yeah.
World War I, 1,000x dead. World War II. And when you close your eyes, you just see a young 19-year-old as a soldier, and it's completely desensitized to that. So women hold a very special power, I suppose, in that we in a way, shake it up and say, no, this is the reality of death when a woman dies. But when a guy dies, it doesn't really matter.
The death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world.
There you go.
An academic study of murder in horror films contemporaneous to Sarah Daniels' masterpieces revealed that 19% of female characters survive, compared to only 10% of male characters. Of course, other studies point out that the women who do die in horror experience on-screen torture and deaths that are, on average, twice as long as their male counterparts.
The problem with the term torture porn is it's incredibly loaded in that it implies that there is a sense of joy at experiencing somebody being tortured.
It originally came from people saying this is a pornography of terror.
Yeah.
And when you use that term, I think people mean a couple of things. They mean excess, they mean titillation, they mean a kind of an excessive focus that kind of chops out all potential narrative.
What people are doing here is they're not unpacking this idea that we're not necessarily indulging in fantasy or in our fantasies while watching visceral horror films. So we can watch something or we can use something, okay? And when we watch visceral horror, I think we're watching it. We're not necessarily trying to kind of use it for any major indulgence in our fantasies. There is countless literature from the Gothic era which indulges in this idea of rape fantasy. It's nothing new. What extreme pornography does is riff on this.
And the implication that watching or reading something is going to immediately result in the acting out of that thing is a deeply problematic assumption.
I, for one, believe that is the greatest horror story of them all, that we are still in 2020 talking about this phantom that possesses us and causes us to act in incredibly bad ways. It doesn't exist. It's witchcraft, right? Yeah. We burned the women back in the day. Let's try and move on from Salem, okay? Media effects, negative media effects do not exist.
Language and representation might shape generally the world that we live in, but individual people are not puppets. Sure, yeah, fine. Porn sites can grab little bits of horror films and they can decontextualize them and they can turn them into pornography or whatever. But I mean, frankly, pornography has been doing this since like the 18th century, the dawn of time. Like you can take bits of the Bible and you can turn them into spank banks. Sex is part of life and therefore it's going to be part of representation.
Promiscuity and survival rates in horror share a well-documented correlation. So perhaps it's no surprise to discover an intersection between porn and horror. One popular pornography site, heavyr.com, currently shows almost 1,000 clips from mainstream horror films posted as pornographic content. So, should horror be stacking the deck against this sort of co-opting?
So where do you fall with boobies then?
I have no problem with boobies,
Yeah.
though I have to say, as someone who oversees a social media site related to horror,
Boobies?
I'm quite anti-booby.
You're why would you be anti-booby?
Because there are quite a lot of kind of horror social media pages out there
Yeah.
that are just there for the boobies.
Yeah.
And you know, I have no problem with them. I happen to own a pair myself. Which
They're
is,
lovely.
you know, thank you. They weren't always this size. I'm quite happy. Nonetheless,
Well, in preparation for the male gaze, you upped them up a bit.
I did a little bit.
Good woman.
But I suppose sometimes I'm just like, oh, for God's sake, does there have to be more boobs? Surely there's something else. And maybe if we just put that to one side, we can look at the other things a little bit more. And I do realise that, you know, apart from the fact that these films are being produced within the patriarchy, I'm talking within the patriarchy, and I have imbibed a lot of these ideas.
I have no issue with women expressing their sexuality within horror films. Zero. Absolutely not. Fly, let them fly. Let them be free. So you kind of have to kind of analyse and interrogate at what point you're starting along the line in which you draw issue with that. And one of the most famous films that I think is one of the most problematic films of all time is The Exorcist.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah, very
so
much.
You see where I'm going
yeah,
with
yeah,
this,
I
right?
do, yeah.
So there's no tits in that, right?
Nope.
But essentially The Exorcist, which is beloved of most people, including myself, and probably everybody, you know, who most horror fans will find very little to fault with it. But it's extraordinarily problematic because at the root of that film is if she just goddamn stayed at home and give up this old acting business, she would have been around looking after her child, and the child wouldn't have been running around the place, being reared by half a dozen strangers, and have gotten possessed.
Yeah.
And not only could she not stay at home and look after their child, she couldn't even sort out the situation. She had to get a man in. A literal father had to come in and exercise. That for me is much more entrenched within a patriarchal response to where we are as a society than any boobs.
We want you to be a part of this conversation. Catch Masterpieces at Dublin's Smock Alley Theatre from March 2nd to 7th at 7:30 p.m. nightly, with a matinee performance on the 7th of March at 2 p.m. Join some of our face-to-face interviewees for a post-show discussion on the 6th or 7th of March and make your voice heard.